Russia and revolutions. Let's just say they've had a few of them. But of course, the most famous of them are the revolutions of 1917, which brought an end to the last Tsar of Russia and the rise of some communists. My name is Anish, and this is part 1 of my videos on Russia's 20th century, which is going to cover the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, the First World War, and the Russian Revolution. Alright, so the year is 1900, and pretty much all countries in Europe are dabbling with democracy and constitutional monarchies. Haha, not Russia. The political system of Russia at the time was something called autocracy. It means that all power is concentrated into the hands of one lucky person. In the Russian case, that lucky person was none other than Tsar Nicholas II, a stubborn man who was in charge of one of the largest empires in history and accountable to absolutely nobody. A recipe for disaster. Quickly, here's an origin story for Nicholas. So he was born in 1868 under the reign of his grandfather Alexander II, who was known in Russia as the Great Reformer. Back in his day, Russia had a system called serfdom, which was pretty similar to slavery, except these Russian serfs made up the majority of the population. A serf was basically someone who was attached to a piece of land, and life for them was pretty grim. They were basically owned by their landlords, they weren't allowed to travel, and if they're lucky, their life expectancy was like 30. The presence of this very backwards feudal system was preventing Russia from getting workers into the cities and modernizing the country. So in 1861, Alexander II decided that he was going to change all of that and emancipated the Russian serfs. That isn't to say life for the Russian peasants got much better. Most were still forced to pay huge redemption payments for their freedom, and 40 years later, still hardly any peasants actually owned their own land, which was a big issue. Anyway, the political system under Alexander II was still very autocratic, but again, he was thinking of changing that. But on the day that Alexander was going to make constitutional reforms and create a parliament, a bomb explosion went off in St. Petersburg, and he was badly wounded. Nicholas and his father, Alexander III, watched the Tsar on his deathbed, and they came to the conclusion that this is what happens when you give the people what they want. Alexander III was known as a tough guy, and his reign was marked by a complete crackdown on radical groups and a shift away from his father's more liberal reforms. He died quite young in 1894, and a 26-year-old Nicholas II came to the throne. Russia at this time was a massive empire, but they definitely had threats to deal with. In the east, you have the Japanese who are modernizing and building up their army very quickly. The Russians and the Japanese are both competing for influence of this area of China called Manchuria, because in those days, like, everyone messed with China. And then in the west, you have the German and Austro-Hungarian empires who are getting a little too friendly with each other, and this was starting to scare Russia. These powers had modern, well-equipped armies, and industrialization in Russia was seen as the key to keeping up with them. Nicholas's right-hand man, Sergei Witte, encouraged huge amounts of foreign capital and expertise into Russia, and slowly but surely, Russia was getting there. But at the same time, industrialization meant that millions and millions of workers were coming into the city, and this new working class became the perfect breeding ground for some radical ideas to spread. Marxism. Okay, so we've clarified that Russia has some internal problems, and instead of addressing them, Nicholas decides to go to war with Japan. To be fair, in the early days of the Russo-Japanese War, it did bring the empire together to fight the common enemy, but this sentiment really died out as the war progressed and Russia started losing. Humiliating defeats at the Battle of Mukden and the Battle of Tsushima proved that both Russia's army and navy was inferior to the Japanese. Bear in mind that at the time, no Asian country had managed to defeat a big European power in modern warfare, so this was a huge blow to national prestige. Russia definitely believed that they would achieve a short and decisive victory, but this was not the reality, and a nation that prided itself on its military was completely humiliated by a smaller, supposedly inferior nation. Back at home, anti-war sentiment was growing, and the country became extremely divided. Everything kicked off on the 9th of January 1905, when over 100,000 people, led by a Russian priest, started protesting outside the Winter Palace against the poor working and living conditions in the city. These protesters were peaceful, and some even held portraits of their beloved Tsar. But Nicholas's own personal troops, the Cossacks, were ordered to put down the protests and fired upon the crowds, killing hundreds of innocent civilians. What started as a protest eventually ended up as a massacre, and the event became known as Bloody Sunday. And although Nicholas wasn't even in the palace on that day, it was not a good look for him. The image of the Tsar as the protector of the people was completely destroyed. Across the empire, strikes and protests were widespread, and this marks the beginning of the 1905 revolution. For the next few months, peasant uprisings, worker strikes, soldier mutinies, and a whole load of violence. You get the picture. By October, over 2 million workers were on strike, and the railways and major cities of the empire completely came to a standstill. To end the chaos, the Tsar had to promise political concessions. Nicholas created an elected parliament called the Duma, and at this point it seemed as if the Tsar was willing to give up his autocratic powers. Right? Wrong. In 1906 he issued the Fundamental Laws, and Nicholas made it pretty clear that he was still the MVP and that he wasn't going anywhere. The Duma could be dissolved whenever Nicholas wanted, and he had a veto over any laws that the Duma wanted to pass. The system didn't really change, and even the nobility started to turn on Nicholas. But either way, the regime still survives the 1905 revolution, and it will then have to face its next big test. So the First World War breaks out after an Austro-Hungarian prince was shot up by Serbian nationalists. Russia entered the war in defense of their fellow Slavic country Serbia, and the network of alliances in Europe pretty much drags everyone into it. And here's a crazy fact. The English king, the German Kaiser, and the Russian Tsar were all first cousins. It was one dysfunctional family, and before starting a massive global, all-encompassing war, they probably could have gone on Dr. Phil. So the war starts, and the Russian army is the largest army in the world at the time, estimated to have around 6 million men. But the German army proved to be better trained and far better equipped, and one of the most powerful war machines the world had ever seen. Austria-Hungary not so much. The Eastern Front of the First World War was absolutely brutal and nearly twice the size of the Western Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The German blueprint for victory was to take out the French quickly, then focus on Russia. So Russia tried to go on the offensive, which did not go well. Poorly equipped armies, bad communications, and underdeveloped railways didn't do much to help, and the war was not going well for the Russians. To make matters worse, Nicholas decided that there was only one man who could save the country: himself. So he decided to make himself commander-in-chief of the army in 1915. Very, very stupid, because if anything goes wrong in the war, then he's the one to blame. But that's not all. Well, back home in St. Petersburg, a holy mystic called Rasputin was living in the royal palace. So Nicholas and his wife were cousins, and their son Alexei suffered from a condition called haemophilia. It means that if you get a paper cut, it's not looking good, bruv. Rasputin supposedly could heal Alexei's condition, and so they kept him around as some sort of mystical paramedic. But the public didn't actually know about Alexei's condition, and from their perspective, they're really confused why this man is living with the royal family. When Nicholas left for the front in 1915, he left his German wife Alexandra in charge, and people thought that she and Rasputin were secretly pulling the strings and destroying the country from the inside. Again, not the best look for Nicholas. Anyway, the war was not going well, and it was taking a big toll on the Russian people. All resources were going to the front, and that meant food shortages, awful working conditions, and the government printing a lot of money to fund the war, resulting in massive inflation. The standard of living for the Russian people dropped dramatically, and on the front lines, thousands of soldiers were deserting. So you have people annoyed at the war, people annoyed at the food shortages, and people annoyed at the royal family. Put them together, and what do you get? A Russian Revolution. In 1917, the regime had met its breaking point. On the 22nd of February, women in Petrograd went on strike against the food rationing and poor living conditions in the city. Then the workers started protesting, and soon around 250,000 people filled the city, calling for an end to the war and an end to the Tsar. Things got even worse. As the troops were ordered to fire on the crowds, they refused and actually joined the protesters. With the army on their sides, the situation became completely uncontrollable, and Nicholas had lost control of the capital. Nicholas's ministers and army chiefs advised him to abdicate, and he actually listened to them, although he did try and pass the throne to his brother just before. Classic Nicholas. Anyway, on the 2nd of March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated, and just like that, 400 years of Romanov rule and autocracy in Russia came to an end. The new government put in place was called the Provisional Government, and was made up of ministers from the final Duma. Immediately, this new government announced freedom of opinions, faith, assembly, amnesty for all political prisoners, and promised free and fair elections in Russia. From autocracy, Russia suddenly became the freest society in Europe. But there was another group called the Petrograd Soviet, which was founded by a guy called Leon Trotsky, and it was designed to represent the soldiers and the workers in Russia. The Provisional Government was the internationally recognized body and the official government of Russia, although the Soviets probably had more power here. The main point in which they differed was in regards to the war. The provisional government wanted to keep on fighting, whilst the Soviets wanted to find a peace settlement without losing any territory. The Minister of War in the provisional government was a creepy-looking guy called Kerensky. In June, he launched a massive offensive against Austria-Hungary. That fails badly, and this destabilizes the government, and the whole command structure of the army collapsed. Russia was in an awful state, and in the countryside, a peasant revolution was taking place, as peasants just started stealing land from people. Things got even worse as Ukraine and Finland created their own national parliaments and demanded independence from Russia. So the empire seemed to be falling apart, but a group called the Bolsheviks seemed to have an answer to their problems. So going back a few months, when the news of the revolution was announced, Germany sent an angry little guy called Vladimir Lenin to cook up some trouble in Russia, and he did a pretty good job. He led a group called the Bolsheviks, and their slogan, peace, bread and land, seemed to correspond to exactly what the Russian people wanted: to end the war, stop the food shortages, and fix the land problems. The Bolsheviks' popularity soared in 1917, and by September, they were the major party in the Petrograd Soviet. But the thing about the Bolsheviks was, rather than more moderate Marxists in Russia, they believed that the way to take power was through an armed revolution. That armed revolution was made so much easier when in September, Kerensky gave the Bolsheviks a bunch of weapons to defend Petrograd, fearing that a rogue general called Kornilov was planning to launch a coup against the provisional government. Big mistake. Anyway, by October 1917, the Germans were getting dangerously close to Petrograd, and it seemed like the state was going to collapse. So the Bolsheviks got together and decided that it was time for a little military coup. Without firing a shot, the Bolsheviks took control of the telephone and telegraph lines in the capital, and in the following days, the Red Guards had arrested the provisional government. They took control of the Winter Palace, and that was it. The Bolsheviks had taken power in Russia with relatively low violence. Well, for now. Next up in the Russia series is the Russian Civil War.